Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories Podcast. I'm your host, John DeLynn. We are in the middle of an amazing series with LDS discussions, or my friend, what name are we using? Mike, with my friend Mike from LDS Discussions. We have talked several episodes about the Book of Mormon, and now we're kind of knee deep into the Bible and Mormon truth claims. We've covered Adam and Eve, global flood, Tower of Babel, and Sermon on the Mount in the Book of Mormon. And today we're going to be talking about a subject I literally know zero about, literally zero. The topic is the long ending of Mark and the Book of Mormon. And with us today, as always, on this amazing series is the host and author and founder of the LDS discussions.com website. We're calling him Mike. Hey, Mike.
Hey, how's it going, everybody?
Thanks for joining us again. This is such a great series.
Yeah, I hope, like I said, I feel like I say it every time. I hope it's helpful, and we're getting through the Bible stuff, and then I know a lot of people want to hear about the more historical stuff with Mormonism. So we'll be getting there soon. But these are definitely important ones to cover, to kind of give more of an insight into the scriptures of Mormonism.
Well, today's going to be a quicker one, and so let's just dive right in. We'll break a record for the shortest episode we do. The long ending of Mark in the Book of Mormon. I don't even know what this is, so give us an explanation.
So this is really cool. This is another one that I did not know about until I was in the middle of the overview project, and it was a Radio Free Mormon podcast where he was talking about, I think it was the backdating prophecy one, and he mentions this kind of at the end of the episode, and I was kind of like, what is he talking about? And this is really cool. But what it is that the Gospel of Mark in the New Testament has an ending to it that scholars now have pretty much a universal consensus that the ending of Mark that we know in the King James Bible was actually a late addition. And if you see if you're watching this, the image on the right says, this is from a Bible, and it says, the most reliable early manuscripts and other ancient witnesses do not have Mark chapter 16, verses 9 through 20. And so, like we've talked about in some previous episodes about like the global flood and DNA, this is solid enough to the point where, in this case, Bibles are putting this notation in there. So they still have the verses in, but they're telling the reader of this Bible that these are not part of the early manuscripts and is likely a late addition by a later scribe. And we'll get into some apologetics from people who disagree and think that this was an original ending. But there are a lot of reasons why scholars can show that these verses were late additions to the Gospel of Mark.
Okay. I want to learn. I'm already ready to ask questions, but I know you've got another slide on this. You have a reference or a quote from Bart Ehrman, who is a New Testament scholar who we've had on Mormon Stories, but he is he knows more than almost anyone in the world about kind of how the Bible, especially the New Testament, was put together. So I guess you're going to read from Bart Ehrman to tell us more about the long ending of Mark.
Yeah, and so Bart Ehrman kind of goes through and talks about the clues that the text gives us to tell us it was not original to the text. And so Bart Ehrman says, the evidence that shows that these verses were not original to Mark is similar in kind to that for the story of the woman taken in adultery. It is absent from the two oldest and best manuscripts of Mark's gospel, along with other important witnesses. The writing style varies from what we find elsewhere in Mark. The transition between this passage and the one preceding it is hard to understand. An example of that is Mary is introduced in verse 9 as if she had not been mentioned yet, even though she is discussed in the preceding verses. And then there's another problem with the Greek that makes that transition even more awkward. And then Bart Ehrman says, and there are a large number of words and phrases in the passage that are not elsewhere found in Mark. In short, the evidence is sufficient to convince virtually all textual scholars that these verses are a late addition to the Gospel of Mark.
Okay, and just to back up a tiny bit, is Bart Ehrman taught on his Mormon Stories episode? We think of the Gospels, especially Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as having been written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John while they were alive. And without really going into it, go back and watch the Bart Ehrman episodes. What we learn is that, not only were Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John not written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but they were written like sometimes many generations after the time that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John would have lived. And they contradict each other and conflict in all sorts of ways. And so this is called historical criticism or biblical criticism. And it's a really important approach to help you understand why there's so many problems with the Bible and why you need to take almost everything in the Bible with a grain of salt. And if you still want to believe in the Bible, you can. So having said that, to drill a little bit deeper, if I'm understanding you correctly, Mike, we all know what the Gospel of Mark is, but now we're finding out that there's this chunk that was added later.
Yep.
That and that's important. Why? Because it calls into question whether it's legitimate. It calls into question whether it's reliable.
So for the purpose of this episode, it's going to relate into how it's going to fill into the Book of Mormon. But to back up to what you said, so for anyone who has not done any research on the New Testament textual scholarship, we have the four Gospels, and the earliest written one is Mark. So Mark was written, they believe, about 60 AD, I believe. Matthew and Luke are written after. And so Mark, Matthew, and Luke are known as the synoptic Gospels. They all fit together. And then John is kind of off in its own little world. They believe that was the last one written. And so the reason it's important is because one of the things you see in Matthew and Luke in a lot of ways, and one of them actually says, and I think it might be Matthew, they're actually kind of referencing Mark and basically saying we're correcting some of the things that were said there. Because John Hamer pointed this out, I think in one of the episodes with you, but he points out that the authors, all of the gospel writers are anonymous. There's not Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but Matthew and Luke seem to hate the ending of Mark because the ending of Mark doesn't have this grand resurrection story. And so in a lot of ways, Matthew and Luke are trying to fix that. And then it would appear that this was a widespread kind of worry because as Christology evolves after Jesus dies and is crucified, as that evolves, the Gospels are going to have different meanings to different communities. And so Mark's not going to be written down for 60 years. I think Matthew and Luke are like 75 to 80 or 75 to 90, somewhere in there. And in that time, the Christology is changing and people want that resurrection story in there, and Mark doesn't have it. And so the reason that's important is because using that textual analysis is going to fill in to the Book of Mormon, and that's going to be our next slide. And that will kind of answer that question as to why we're talking about this today.
Yeah, and just to kind of say one more thing about what you're saying, for those who know nothing about historical criticism or the Bible or the New Testament, if you don't look at Matthew, Mark, if you don't look at them as all harmonizing and just filling in respective holes, if you look at them in the sequence in which we know they were written, it's kind of like a fish story, right? Yep. The fish grows over time. And in the same way, this is something you just mentioned, people won't know what Christology means if they haven't studied this. What you mean, tell me if I'm right, Mike, what you mean by Christology is that the story about who Christ was gets bigger and bigger and more significant the later the account is. And so in the first written gospel, and I don't remember which one it is, Jesus is more just like a wise, more of almost like just a wise rabbi or a really important prophet, not necessarily the Son of God sitting on the right-hand throne. But then the next gospel, the story gets a little bit bigger. Jesus gets more powerful. And by the end, Jesus is what? Like by the final, gospel, Jesus is the Son of God and resurrected and dies again and all that.
Well, and the resurrections is in all. But what's really cool about the different gospels is you can see a little bit of the evolution of how people perceived him. And so I might bungle this a little bit, but I think in Mark's the first one. I believe Jesus isn't really considered a divine being until he's baptized, I think. And then I think in Matthew, it's when he's born. And then when you get to John, he's divine from the beginning of everything, And so it just shows that, in the beginning, they viewed Jesus' divinity a little differently. Then all of a sudden when you get to John, which John is is not historical, really, it's more theological. But in John, Jesus is divine from the creation of the world, whereas in the other ones, it's when he's baptized and then when he's born. And it's why Mark does not have a nativity scene, but Matthew and Luke have a nativity scene. And so those differences have a lot to do with the fact that the communities that these stories are being told to have different developments in their beliefs and also have different needs that they're trying to address with these teachings. And so that's why there are discrepancies. And as we've mentioned, these are not going to be written down for many decades after Jesus would die. And so imagine a game of telephone that you play on the playground where you have 10 kids. The first kid tells a sentence, and by the time you get to the 10th kid, it's a lot different. Well, these stories are being retold and retold and retold. And so that's why you have the discrepancies, because this is like a game of telephone through different communities, through many decades before they're written down. And so these stories develop in different ways. And so while there are a lot of similarities, there's also a lot of discrepancies. And that's a problem, especially when you get into issues within Mormonism, because of the fact that Joseph's going to pull these as if they were written contemporaneously and that they're kind of free of problems.
Do you have an essay on New Testament scholarship?
I mean, not really. We have, so we've got the long ending of Mark, and then we did our last episode was on Sermon on the Mount. So those things kind of, I think, cover a lot of it, but I don't really have one just to New Testament stuff, just because for the most part, everything I was doing was kind of looking at it through the lens of Mormonism. But like I said, it's absolutely fascinating. And I would recommend anyone who is interested, especially in New Testament. Bart Ehrman has a blog, and I know he referenced it on the episode I did with you. I think it's like Ehrman blog, but just Google Bart Ehrman blog. And it's like $25 a year. He donates all the money to charity, but he puts up like 4 or 5 things a week. And I signed up for it a few years ago. And I don't read it that often, but it's just amazing because you could search for literally any topic and he will go through what the scholars say. He has people on his blog who disagree with them. And so it's just really cool because you learn all these little tidbits as to why they were writing certain things, like why, I always grew up thinking the Book of Revelations was about the future. And then you learn, no, the Book of Revelations is about like, Nero and the Roman Empire. And it's just so cool because it really gives a much better meaning to the texts. It also helps you understand why they were written, when they were written. But on the flip side, it also is going to force you to rethink some of the beliefs that we had, especially when we talk about literalism in the Bible.
Yep. And we'll also put a link to some of his books. Is Jesus Interrupted? Is that one of his books? So we've got The Triumph of Christianity, Misquoting Jesus, Reinventing Jesus. We'll put a list to several of his books up there as well. Anyway.
Yep. Yeah. Anyway, so
right.
and that's why this is, and so we go to the next slide. This is why it matters for the Book of Mormon. And so the problem with regards to the Book of Mormon is that language from these verses of Mark, which we now know were attached to the Gospel of Mark by an unidentified scribe, likely a couple hundred years after it was originally written down, appears in the Book of Mormon. And so Mark chapter 16, verses 17 through 18, which are part of the late edition, says, "And these signs shall follow them that believe. In my name they shall cast out devils, they shall speak with new tongues, they shall take up serpents, and if they drink any deadly thing, it shall not hurt them. They shall lay hands on the sick, and they shall recover." Now, this is in Mormon 9:24 in the Book of Mormon. "And these signs shall follow them that believe. In my name they shall cast out devils, they shall speak with new tongues, they shall take up serpents, and if they drink any deadly thing, it shall not hurt them. They shall lay hands on the sick, and they shall recover." So almost word for word in the Book of Mormon is part of a text in Mark, which was not authentic or original to the gospel, which the Book of Mormon people would have no access to anyway. So we have like layers upon layers of anachronistic problems here. And that's why this is so important for the Book of Mormon.
Did you read the Mormon verse?
I did.
Okay. All right. So if I'm just, and I need to go slowly on this one because I know nothing about this. So we've got the 2 verses in Mark that are considered late additions.
Yep.
And they're appearing almost word for word in Mormon in the Book of Mormon.
Yep.
Okay. All right.
And so if you go to the next slide, this will kind of explain. So we've talked about this before, but it's incredibly anachronistic by any definition for the Book of Mormon to have King James wording within its text, because the KJV was not produced until 1611. And then you add to that how anachronistic it is for the Book of Mormon to have New Testament material and a really frequent reliance on it. And it also carries a 19th century Christology, which we talked about, which is a problem because these are supposed to be books of an ancient people who have a 19th century understanding of how we believe about Jesus Christ. And so to think that they would have access to any of this material when Lehi leaves with the brass plates, it makes no sense because he'd have no access to the New Testament. He would have no knowledge of Jesus Christ. Yet in the Book of Mormon, they know all of these things, even though they don't have access to it. And so the long ending of Mark, because it's not an original part of the gospel, it's kind of like, an anachronism on steroids, because not only is it anachronistic to have King James language in the Book of Mormon, not only is it anachronistic to have New Testament material in the Book of Mormon, but now we have New Testament King James material that was not authentic to the original Gospel of Mark, which tells us that Joseph Smith is using a very late script for a text that's purportedly ancient.
And again, this is probably coming from the Bible that we know Joseph Smith had, right?
Yeah, and so the phrases match the King James version pretty much identically as we did the last slide. But yeah, so he's pulling in, a King James version, which obviously has issues with the translation and the phrasing, as we've talked about before. Then New Testament material, which Book of Mormon people could not have accessed, and then to have material that is not authentic to the Gospel of Mark appearing in another ancient text. That's highly problematic because, we'll get into the apologetics, but yeah, it's like an anachronism on top of an anachronism on top of a huge one, because it's like, again, we've talked about kind of foundational stuff. This is what is considered to not be a text that will be authentic to the original Gospel of Mark. So how is it in a text that's supposed to be happening in the Americas that they would have never known about? And it really illustrates the problems that come from Joseph Smith relying so heavily on the King James Bible, because he wouldn't have known at this time. No one, I don't think, at this time knew that this would be a late edition, because they didn't have the textual, desire to criticize. David Bachboy talks in this episode about how the Bible is a privileged text, and so people didn't criticize it in a textual way until, I don't know exactly when. So Joseph Smith probably is not going to have access to people who are like, yeah, this is likely a late edition, and so he includes it in the Book of Mormon because he just assumes it's authentic to the text.
And also, we will refer people to our previous episode, like you say, Book of Mormon and the King James Version for an overview as well, right?
Yep, definitely.
Okay.
Definitely. And
all right.
And so we talk in a lot
There's
of
a
these
pattern
episodes.
here.
Yeah, we talk in these episodes about patterns. And so we've been building on this theme, but the pattern becomes clear that Joseph Smith is completely reliant on both 19th century text and 19th century ideas when producing his scriptures. And so Joseph Smith is pulling material that would never have been made available to Book of Mormon people, that contains the errors of later translations, and worst of all, in some instances, such as the long ending of Mark, text that would not be authentic to the declared author. So in this case, it's an addition by a later scribe. Deutero-Isaiah, which we're going to get into, is where a second person is writing under the name of Isaiah, almost like pseudepigrapha, and they both make their way into the Book of Mormon, which is a huge problem, because now we have patterns where Joseph Smith is not just sometimes pulling in biblical stuff and making errors, such as like believing that Adam and Eve is a literal story, the global flood's a literal story, but also pulling in text that is not only anachronistic to being in the ancient Americas, but becomes problematic because it's not authentic to the text. And so you just have all of these layers of problems, and then you have it happening over and over again, which is going to tell you that the writer of the Book of Mormon was using very late text and ideas to produce it.
Yeah. And again, we have, if you haven't been watching or listening in series, we have a full episode on Deutero-Isaiah. And our next episode.
Yeah, next episode is
Deutero-Isaiah.
Isaiah. Yeah, so that's the next one. And it's
So
going to
we'll
follow
get to
some of these. Yeah, it'll follow some of these same problems. And that's why this is so important to cover, because once you start seeing that it happens more than once, it's really hard to just be like, oh, it's just, an error, or, we'll get to the apologetic responses. But yeah, it becomes difficult to use these apologetic responses when it keeps happening in different ways that are all tied back to Joseph Smith.
Yeah, if God, and this is to our translation episode, if Joseph's looking at a stone and literally Joseph's reading from it, why isn't God just giving the pure word of Jesus, or an independent story that's in just regular English? Why is he happening to channel into the seer stone the text that conveniently is on the Bible that's probably sitting right next to Joseph at the time? It kind of strange credulity that God would work that way if Joseph's reading off a stone.
And that's just it. And and we're told in the translation episode that the stone doesn't change until the words are read perfect. And so then you have to say, well, is God giving Joseph Smith a text from Mark that we know is, from a scholarly perspective, not authentic? And it just makes no sense, because it would have no place in the Americas regardless. And so that's why you start looking at it and you go, well, it couldn't have come from God unless God is willing to trick Joseph Smith. And then if it's coming from Joseph Smith, and then you have to answer, like, again, because we're trying to tie these back into earlier episodes. In the 116 pages episode, we're told through revelation that God will not allow Joseph Smith basically to be proven false, or to be, taken down by Lucy Harris trying to expose him. And yet again and again and again, he puts things in the scriptures that we know now today in 2022 are not correct. And so then you go, well, why is God allowing him to be proven a false prophet 200 years later, yet the 116 pages he puts a stop to immediately? You would think there'd be consistency there. And again, I know calling him a false prophet is going to be hard for a believer, but I am saying that when he makes these claims that these texts are from ancient America and we can show they weren't even authentic to the biblical text, that's a huge problem. That would show that whoever wrote it was pulling from more contemporary sources and not from ancient text.
All right. So what is the apologetic response to this? Do they acknowledge that it's a problem?
Nah, not really. So this is from Fair Mormon, but they're heavily leaning off of a Book of Mormon Central article. So that's why I'm putting Fair/Book of Mormon Central, just for anyone who's wondering why I'm combining them. It's Fair Mormon kind of using them as their kind of their main rebuttal. And so they say, in recent years, several scholars have argued that the text in Mark 16, 9 through 20 is indeed an authentic part of the Gospel of Mark. And I just want to point out, you can always find a few scholars who are going to argue for any position, especially in a situation where you're talking about biblical history, because we're going to have a lot of religions that are going to want to fight for that position because of the fact that if it's not historical, it does create some issues as to why it was added. And does that mean that the additions were, late, kind of like late backfitting of stories? And so, again, to say several scholars have argued it really ignores the fact that the consensus is saying that's not the case. And I think that's really important to note, because they're basically saying, let's listen just to these few people and ignore all of the other people who are working off of a lot of it. We said with Bart Ehrman's thing, it's not just, there's different reasons. It's the language. It's the fact that there's phrasing that's not authentic. There's issues with the way the Greek is written there versus the original part of Mark. And so they're telling you to ignore all of the evidence we have, because there might be a few people who are going against the consensus. And I'm not saying you should always ignore people who are going against the consensus. I'm just saying you shouldn't present it as if that means the problem goes away, because it doesn't. It just means that they're giving plausibility, and we're obviously going to go through that here.
Anybody with an understanding of how academics and scholarship and science works will realize that consensus is what you should always go with.
Yep.
You can mention outliers, but it's disingenuous to number one, not name the several scholars, but to cite anomalies or exceptions within the discipline, especially if they're motivated by religious motivations, to be exceptions and to ignore overwhelming consensus. It's just dishonest, and they should know better.
Yeah, and I think they do cite one of the scholars, I think, but the point is, like I was saying, you can find some scholars who will tell you that the Book of Abraham is actually on a lost scroll against all the evidence, or you can find some scholars in the church who will tell us, that the Book of Abraham, that Joseph Smith got some of it right when, as you had Dr. Robert Rittner on, he was going through those point by point and showing why it's being misused. And so to find several scholars to go against the consensus still doesn't necessarily answer the problems that come from the consensus. And more importantly, they're citing some scholars here. And as we go through these few slides on apologetics, I'm going to kind of point out why they're not actually going to solve the problem for Mormonism. Those scholars might be trying to solve the problem for a more mainstream Christian view. But Mormonism, just like we've talked about the Adam and Eve and the Tower of Babel and the global flood, they're cementing this down as literal history. And that is when it gets messier than it does for more, other Christian religions.
Yeah. And with the Book of Abraham, it's not just that, the overwhelming consensus of scholars view it differently than the BYU scholars. It's that the Book of Abraham is a laughing stock to the entire discipline. It's ridiculous to the entire field of Egyptology, and an insult to the discipline of Egyptology outside of BYU.
Yeah,
and apologists should acknowledge that sort of thing when they're trying to cite scholarship, I think.
Well, no, and when we get to the Book of Abraham episodes, we'll talk about that, just because there's a very interesting way that the church's two main apologists for the Book of Abraham handle Egyptology, because when they present peer-reviewed papers to the greater community of scholars, it's never about the Book of Abraham. It's about actual Egyptian things, and then they use those credentials and to push Book of Abraham apologetics under the guise of being an expert in Egyptology. And that's where you start to get into kind of using your scholarship to push bad apologetics, and you see that everywhere. But you have to be aware of it when you're doing this, because in this case that we're talking about today, and we'll go through it, but they're kind of using someone else's argument and just kind of trying to slap it onto Mormonism. But Mormonism has more problems because of the fact that it brings it into another ancient text.
Yeah. All right. So now you're asking, was there a longer ending in the original? Is it the Bible manuscript?
Yeah, the original manuscript for Mark. And so Fair and / Book of Mormon Central will say, it is also significant that several scholars who reject Mark 16 verses 9 through 20 as part of the original Gospel of Mark nonetheless believe that the long ending pre-existed its attachment to Mark. And again, we're talking about using several scholars to go over the kind of almost unanimous consensus here. But one of the things Dr. Bart Ehrman states, as we mentioned earlier, is some scholars agree with the scribes in thinking that 16:8 is too abrupt an ending for a gospel. As I indicated, it is not that these scholars believe the final 12 verses in our later manuscripts were the original ending. They know that's not the case, but they think that possibly the last page of Mark's gospel, one in which Jesus actually did meet the disciples in Galilee, was somehow lost, and then all of our copies of the gospel go back to this one truncated manuscript without the last page. And this is really important, because this is saying what Book of Mormon Central and Fair Mormon are saying is some scholars think that there was a longer ending. And my point is this: there might have been a longer ending, but the problem is that is the long ending that ends up in the Book of Mormon. So even if there was an original one that a scribe tried to replace hundreds of years later, Joseph Smith is still using the replacement. He's not, no matter how you want to do this, Joseph Smith is still using an added text. So they're basically kind of throwing a little bit of a smokescreen here by saying that some scholars say there was a longer ending originally. And no one, like Dr. Ehrman says, no one's arguing that. What we're saying with Mormonism is Joseph Smith, no matter how you cut it, is still using the ending that is a late addition. And that's the problem.
Okay. And I'm sorry, I'm just not super smart about this stuff. So Mark has 16 chapters.
Yep.
And we're literally talking about the final verses. So
yeah.
So the final verses of Mark are it's an abrupt ending. What do you mean?
So if you read Mark chapter 16, it ends basically with them being told, go and tell no one about what you saw, right? And so it is a very fairly abrupt ending. I'll read the last few verses. So it would end, and it says, they go and they're looking at the tomb, and he says, the guy at the tomb says, he saith unto them, be not affrighted. Ye seek Jesus of Nazareth, which was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. Behold the place where they laid him. But go your way, tell his disciples and Peter that he goeth before you into Galilee. There shall ye see him. And he said unto you. And they went out quickly and fled from the sepulchre. I always say that wrong. Sepulchre. I always get that messed up. For they trembled and were amazed. Neither said they anything to any man, for they were afraid. End. That's it. So it's a really abrupt ending, right? And so
wait, that's verse 8 you just read.
That's where it would end.
But it goes through to 20.
So 9 through 20 is what would be a late addition from a scribe. So 9 through 20 is the part of Mark that scholars say is a late addition. So that's why some scholars will argue there probably was a longer original manuscript, because it is a really abrupt ending. And that's also why, as John Hamer pointed out, the authors of Matthew and Luke probably hated it, because it's so abrupt. It doesn't really give the real resurrection story. And so
yeah, it's almost like the verse reboots in the middle. I mean, the chapter reboots in the middle of the chapter.
And that's why when
Jesus is saying in 7, I'm sorry, this is all just now coming together for me. Yeah, because in 8 he's saying, and they went out quickly and fled from the sepulchre, for they trembled and they were amazed. Neither said they anything to any man, for they're afraid. And then 9 says, now when Jesus was risen early the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene. Okay, we're repeating what you said earlier, but now
it makes, and when you read it, and that's the thing
of Mark 8 is clearly an end, and then it's almost like in verse 9 it backs up and gives a new ending, and that's like jarring. Of course
it is.
None of us ever noticed this before.
No. And again, that's why Bart Ehrman kind of we talked about earlier how it's not just the fact that it kind of seems jarring, but the fact that when they look at the original Greek, there's some issues that tell you that the writer of 9 through 20 is likely a different person, because you're using different words that appear nowhere else in Mark. It's like if you're writing a book, you're going to use a lot of patterns and in phrases, kind of like "and it came to pass," or we talk about "therefore" and "wherefore." Those things
Right.
in the Book of Mormon, and so those clues tell them that this is a second author. And so what Fair Mormon and Book of Mormon Central are saying is saying that because it's so abrupt, there are scholars that believe there might have been addition to that text that was original that got lost, and so some scribe down the road was trying to replace it to make it more of a fulfilling gospel to readers. The problem is Joseph Smith, no matter how true that might be, is still going to use the late edition that we have today, and that's the problem for Mormonism, because Joseph Smith is pulling from, whether or not there was an original lost ending, he's still pulling from a late edition. It doesn't really matter if there was an original ending that got lost, because we know what Joseph's pulling from.
Okay, so I'm going to ask for your forgiveness, but
No, go ahead.
to explain to me one more time why this question of was there a longer ending in the original manuscript? Explain one more time why this is so significant.
So basically, what Fair Mormon is saying here is to say that there are scholars who believe that there was originally an ending that goes beyond verse 8 there. So they're basically saying
So
there's
once upon a time, there was something else that came after 8.
Yeah, and if you think about it, there are, when you talk about documents throughout time, there's going to be documents where pieces get broken off or lost. And so just picture this being on a scroll or something, and this piece getting kind of torn off on accident and lost. And they didn't have tons of scrolls back then. So
Someone uses it for toilet paper, right?
yeah, I mean, but it happens. And so
Yeah.
what Bart Ehrman is saying in that quote below is to say, no one's really, like, there are a lot of people that would freely admit that there might have been a longer ending originally, but it was lost. And so because it was lost, we can still tell that what we have today is still a late edition. And so Book of Mormon Central and Fair Mormon are saying you don't have to worry about it, because some scholars say there originally was a longer ending, but that's missing the point that Joseph Smith is still using the later one either way. So he's still using the inauthentic one, no matter what might have happened to any original long ending of Mark.
Okay. All right. But I mean, and just because I'm really thick, it could be that the part that shows up first is the older or the newer, and the part that came later is older or newer, right? Like, we don't know if the long ending predates or follows, correct?
Well, the only thing they can tell from the text is to say that the person who wrote 9 through 20 is likely a different author because of the different wordings he uses.
They're different. It's
They're
different.
different. And I believe, and now I might be misremembering this a bit, but I believe in 9 through 20, there's also some word kind of phrasing that seems to be borrowing from, I think, Matthew as well. And so that's another area where they're kind of saying, like, this is a little bit later of language than Mark was. And so it's not just that this could have been like an ending that maybe got lost and reattached. It's because of the fact that they can show that it almost certainly is a different writer altogether. So then whoever did write the original Gospel of Mark, if there was an original ending, the ending should still kind of match that writing style, the phrasings. Because this doesn't, it tells us that it's a second author. In the dating, it's not that it's irrelevant. It's just that even if it's dated to like 50 years later or 200 years later, it's still going to be a second author and not original to the gospel. And yet Joseph Smith is pulling it into the Book of Mormon as if it would be.
Yeah. So it's just kind of weird. We've got this Frankenstein book in the New Testament.
Yeah.
So it would make no sense that somehow a book that was Frankenstein together is somehow magically appearing on Joseph's peepstone.
Exactly.
We would expect whatever came through the peepstone, even if it was somehow miraculously referencing Mark, which makes no sense to begin with,
right?
It would do so from a consistent, intact manuscript.
Yeah, and so in theory, if Joseph Smith was channeling an original manuscript of Mark at the end, we wouldn't even know it because we wouldn't have it to compare to. But because he's pulling from the late edition, we can see the phrasing are identical, and that's how you know where he's coming from.
Yeah.
And so that's the problem.
Okay. All right. That's weird.
Okay. So then Fair Mormon and Book of Mormon Central continue and say, another important detail to keep in mind is that even among those who reject the authenticity of Mark 16, 9 through 20, there is considerable debate about how the Gospel of Mark originally ended. And again, I just want to point out, this is not the problem at all. The problem is that the version that we do have, which is a late edition, is not in the earliest manuscripts, yet ends up in the Book of Mormon, that should not have any New Testament material in the first place, let alone what is a later addition to Mark. So this is just, again, a distraction to say, We don't know how it originally ended, but that doesn't matter, because even if it ended in a way that was similar but written completely different, the fact that we have the exact same phrases in the Book of Mormon tells us Joseph Smith was pulling from that late edition. So this is just a smokescreen to keep you from understanding why the problem applies to Mormonism. So they're trying to almost solve a problem for Christianity, except that Joseph Smith expands the issue in the Book of Mormon, and that's what we're trying to figure out here.
Yeah, it's like a red herring or a smoke screen to take
Yep.
you off the scent of the
Yep.
real problem, which is the pattern of how Mormon apologetics often acts.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, we've been pointing it out, and so it's just like I said, it's this is a shorter episode, obviously, but it's a problem that's really important, because this should not be there, and yet we can kind of see not just the fact that it's there, but also the way the apologetics are working with it, which I think is just as important. And so this is the last part from the Fair Mormon article that I wanted to talk about, and they just say, it is important to recognize, however, that even though the English translation of Mormon 9:22 through 24 was possibly influenced by the King James translation of Mark 16:15 through 18, Moroni's source was not the Gospel of Mark. Rather, Moroni was drawing on the teachings of Christ recorded among the Nephites, Mormon 9:22. Thus, the authenticity of the words of Jesus in Mormon 9:22 through 25 is not ultimately dependent on the authenticity of the long ending of Mark. Indeed, belief in the authenticity of these words in the ending of Mark may, or on the other hand, benefit from the testimony of the Book of Mormon. And so what they're saying here is almost, it's very circular logic. They're saying the long ending of Mark is true because the Book of Mormon is true. And that's just a really horrible way to look at it. And to argue that the Book of Mormon is not being directly influenced by the King James translation is just ridiculous, because to say that Moroni's source is not the King James Bible ignores the fact that we can show directly that Joseph Smith is using the King James Bible throughout the entire Book of Mormon. And so to say possibly there is just a weasel word that is being thrown in to effectively give some, to try to keep you off the track of the real problem here. And so on both of these issues, I think they're missing the mark in such a bad way. And as a believer, I think you can kind of read it and just kind of go, oh, yeah. But when you take away that layer, it's like, oh, these are horrible apologetics, because you're using the Book of Mormon, which we can show as a 19th century text, to try to give authenticity to the long ending of Mark, which is just a really bad way to do it.
Yeah. And again, we'll reference people to our episode on King James Version in the Book of Mormon and Deutero-Isaiah. But, whether it's the italics that goes from Joseph Smith's Bible into the Book of Mormon, or the phraseology or plagiarized text, or all the Isaiah in Second Nephi, or the Deutero-Isaiah that shouldn't be there, or the Sermon on the Mount, there's just zero question that it is factual that Joseph had his 17 whatever hundred version of the King James Bible there in the room. He's reading from it and inserting that text into what becomes the Book of Mormon. And anyone who tries to say that he was not doing that, these apologists are really deceiving people. They really are.
It's a horrible. It goes against all the evidence we have. And again, we've talked about this in previous episodes, but this idea that you throw out what you don't know in hopes that maybe what we find out is good is just, you wouldn't give the space to any other religion. And so if we want to be consistent, you cannot say that all of these, the Book of Mormon is screaming that it's taking from the King James Bible. So if you want to say Moroni's source was the teachings of Christ, then you have to argue, why are there errors from the King James Bible if that's not the source? And that's where obviously their article is going to just completely sidestep that, because it's trying to fix one problem while opening up problems elsewhere. And that's what we keep talking about in these episodes. And that's why going through these things the way we're doing is so important, so that once you start seeing these patterns, both from Joseph Smith and apologetics, then when you get to these things, all of a sudden you'll start noticing these things before I tell you. In these, like, as we do these episodes down the road, you're going to start picking up on them before I go to the next slide and tell you why I think it's a problem, because you're going to be starting to look at it in a more critical way to see the tricks they're doing to try to deflect from these problems and try to make you think they're not going to be an issue for Mormonism, because we've found a way to make it work elsewhere.
Yeah, this is really bad apologetics. It's up there with, like, maybe when they said horse, they meant taper kind of thing. It's the type of apologetic that has caused so many people to go from questioning the church to reading Fair Mormon and the Maxwell Institute to feeling like they're being intentionally misled and deceived through dishonest means, which then makes them want to leave the church. I think it's a fair argument to say that a lot of Mormon apologetics actually accelerates people's disaffection for Mormonism,
Yeah.
which you think if I hated the church, I would just want to see fair, I would want to see fair Mormons succeed with their deceptions. But the truth is, I just want people to know the truth and to be able to think clearly. And that's why fair Mormon just needs to go away, because this is hurting everybody. This stuff's hurting everybody.
It does. And that's a good segue into the next one, actually, kind of talking about the way
Yeah, all
apologetics
the
works. So
footnotes. Yeah.
I have an article on ldsdiscussions.com called Follow the Footnotes. I'm kind of leaning into that, but this isn't in there. But so in that article I've been citing from Book of Mormon Central, they have a footnote and cited as number 13 that claims Moroni's source in writing this material was not the Gospel of Mark. And when you actually go to the footnote, it's not even a source. It's an editorial note that says, it is unreasonable to believe, and there is no evidence that Joseph either opened a Bible to the ending of Mark and read these words, or had memorized them and then wove them smoothly into the flow of the translation of Mormon 9. And this is just a horrible argument because, again, yeah, there's no proof. We don't have someone saying Joseph had the Bible open, but textually we have all sorts of proof that Joseph Smith is using the King James Bible. And I will tell you guys, we covered this in the Book of Mormon, how the Book of Mormon was composed episode. If you want to see how Joseph Smith was able to weave text together, watch that episode again when we talk about the parable of the olive tree. Joseph Smith absolutely weaves his words from the King James Bible into the text. And in that case, he was weaving two different sources into a text, and he was doing it in a way that tells us when he kind of lost track of where he was pulling from. So to say that we have no proof or evidence that he did it is just absolutely goes against all of the evidence we have. And so, again, I don't know how more to, we've illustrated this so many times throughout these episodes. And so for Book of Mormon Central to state that as fact, again, it's in a different realm, and it goes from being scholarly to just being trying to, Book of Mormon Central has a lot of, they're not my favorite apologists because they do take a lot of liberties with a lot of their material, but it does not make any sense. And then to stick with their reasoning just for fun, it leaves you with two options. One is that God preserved the gold plates for thousands of years, only to give Joseph Smith a revelation from the stone in the hat, which matches the King James Bible with translation errors, italics, and late additions included, which is what they're saying. Or two, Joseph would pull these long phrases and verses as he saw fit, which necessitates the use of the King James Bible during the composition of the Book of Mormon, as many of these long passages are nearly identical, as we show above with Mark, and obviously as we've shown before with errors and italics as well. I mean, there's no other way to do this.
Yeah. And I'm just really tired of this. There is no evidence argument.
Right.
They try to do this with polygamy. Brian Hales will say, well, there's no evidence that Joseph Smith had sex with any of his plural wives or any of his underage wives or any of his wives that were married to other men. I'm like, what do they want? A VHS tape? Do they want do they want video? Like, what do they want? And there is evidence. There's all these women after Joseph Smith died who signed sworn affidavits that they had sex with Joseph in the very deed. There's women who wrote in their journals, and yet apologists want to say there's no evidence. And I just hate this argument of there's no evidence.
Well, I will give one thing I will say is Brian Hales will admit that he had sex with them because he actually has he runs the Joseph Smith polygamy site. So he does have a page on it, but there are a lot of people a lot of apologists will say there's no proof, and they'll say that the people who are saying,
he'll say there's no proof of sex with the underage or polyandrous one.
Right. Yeah, he will say that. I think there's one polyandrous one where he says it's kind of like there's some like what's I'm trying to think of the word, like fragmentary possibility. And we'll get into this with polygamy. There's a lot of implications beyond whether or not he actually had sex with the two 14-year-old polygamous wives. But I think what we see here is just they'll state these things as fact in these footnotes, and it's like it's not a source, and you are going against all evidence to say there's no proof that Joseph Smith didn't use the King James Bible. Just again, it's special pleading to such a degree that it defies any logic, and it would be space that you would never create for anyone else. Like if you were a professor, if whoever wrote this Book of Mormon Central article was a professor, and someone was plagiarizing long passages from another book, and that professor figured out, he or she from Book of Mormon Central, they figured it out, and they called the student in. And the student looked at him in the eye and they said, you have no proof that I own those books or open them. Do you think that professor's gonna be like, you know what, you're right, I'm gonna give you an A? Or do you think they're gonna be like, I don't care, there's too many? You know what I mean? Like, you cannot apply this logic one way with Mormonism and then criticize critics for, or criticize any other person for plagiarism. You lose that moral ground forever if you're going to make this claim. And to do so, in a way that doesn't present all of the evidence that tells us the opposite is where I get frustrated, because at least with what I'm doing on the overviews, I'm giving you the links to this. If you want to read more on what they say, the links are on the website. So nobody who's reading my stuff can go away and say he's hiding it, because I'm literally answering it and putting the links to it. Yet on the flip side, they're putting footnotes to make it look scholarly. And then the footnote itself is just basically saying, a statement of fact, which is just not even within the realm of reasonable thought. And so, and again, I don't want to rant too much about apologetics, but yeah, this is why it's a problem. And this is why you have to follow the footnotes and be careful about what you're perceiving as scholarly references, because sometimes they're just not.
No, these are not written. It's just like Richard Bushman once said that Sunday school is not to educate, it's a
Right.
ritual. Apologetics, Mormon apologetics is never to find truth. It's to get you to stop thinking, or to
Right.
get you to think there's no problem, or to mislead you, to provide you with false information so you arrive at inaccurate conclusions.
Yeah.
Mormon apologetics is never, never about discerning the truth.
Yeah.
I think.
Well, I mean, it's about keeping you in the boat, and so,
Yeah.
I mean, that's
And
just the only
it
way.
tells you that.
Yeah.
All right. So we're done. Well, let's
Yeah.
conclude. What's the concluding slide for this episode?
So just basically to wrap up, the long ending of Mark is not in the earliest manuscripts. And so while we've mentioned that some scholars debate whether or not there was an original ending, the overwhelming consensus is that whatever ending might have existed is not what we have in the Bible today. And so that is, again, that's the huge differentiation between kind of the apologetic response and what I'm trying to portray, is that Joseph Smith using New Testament material is anachronistic by itself, but then using text in the Book of Mormon that we know one way or the other was a late addition, it kind of elevates that problem to a whole new level. And we've illustrated throughout these overviews that these problems continually point to the author of the Book of Mormon being someone in the 1820s that's relying on a 19th century view of the Bible and Christianity. And those clues and those fingerprints are telling us not just who wrote the Book of Mormon, how they produced it, where they're pulling material from, and how we can date the text. And the long ending of Mark obviously is not a modern text. It was added a couple hundred years after the original Gospel of Mark was probably penned down. But the fact is, these are fingerprints that tell us whoever wrote the Book of Mormon did not know this kind of biblical scholarship, believed it to be literal history. And so when you add all of the overviews we talked about, we're just in a situation where, as I've said before, not only could the Book of Mormon not have been written before the 1820s, but no one else but Joseph could have written it. And here, this just shows us that it cannot be ancient or historical, because it's putting into the words of ancient prophets material that was just simply not authentic to the Bible and would have never been accessible by anyone in the Americas.
Yeah. And just think back to the episodes you've already watched. The witnesses to the creation of the Book of Mormon. Think of the tight and loose translation episode. Well, and the golden plates episode. We're told that golden plates were preserved and given to Joseph. We're told that he had his stone in a hat, and it was telling him word for word, what should be written down to the scribes. It makes no sense that an imperfect Bible of a specific edition would be channeled through that stone in the hat. What if you go with Occam's razor? What makes much more sense is that Joseph had his Bible sitting next to him, and because there was a sheet between him potentially, or he's on the stairs or whatever, he's accessing that Bible and then reading that. And that's why those passages in the Bible, along with the italics and everything else, that's why it's appearing in the Book of Mormon. Occam's razor, you decide, but I think you've made a great case here today. So thank you, Mike.
Thanks so much.
All right. So what's next? What's next, Mike?
I'm trying to think what we got next on this list here. We've got, I believe,
Deutero-Isaiah.
Yeah, Deutero-Isaiah is next, and that one's going to be a good one, because it really is a similar issue to this, where we're talking about material that was a later addition that is going to appear in the Book of Mormon when it would have no ability to be in there. And so these are areas where scholars can now date some of these biblical texts. And again, these might not be huge problems for people who have more of a general belief in the Bible, because Joseph Smith is going to build off of it with the Book of Mormon. It becomes massive problems. And so, as we talked about in our first, kind of overview with Adam and Eve, these areas of biblical scholarship, a lot of times you might kind of glaze over a bit and be like, why does this matter for Mormonism? But it actually undercuts the historicity of Mormonism before you even get into any, uniquely Mormon things, and that's why they're so important to kind of try to piece out together, kind of topic by topic.
Yeah. And I have to say, just objectively speaking, every episode we've done so far has been a smoking gun as far as I'm concerned. I've been impressed with every episode every episode's been a big deal. And as soon as Deutero Isaiah is one of the biggest deals
Yep.
for so many people, it's up there with Book of Abraham. And then we immediately are going to start First Vision and the Priesthood Restoration and the Word of Wisdom, Kinderhook plates, changes to Doctrine and Covenants. We've got so many amazing episodes to come. So I'm super excited, Mike.
I am too. It'll be fun.
You stay healthy. Watch out when you're walking on the sidewalk. You stay healthy and safe, Mike, because we want to make it all the way through.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me again.
All right. Thanks so much. Thanks
Bye,
so
everybody.
much, Mike. And thanks again to everyone for joining us today on Mormon Stories Podcast. Again, this episode can be the text for what inspired this episode can be found at ldsdiscussions.com/Mark. We have show notes in the description of this episode, as well as time codes. So if you don't like our commentary, you can always go to YouTube, watch on YouTube, and then skip to the parts that you want to skip to and skip over our commentary. But many of you have given us the feedback that you want commentary, you want analysis, and that's what you're valuing about these episodes. So continue to give us your feedback at mormonstories@gmail.com. You can also comment on YouTube or on Facebook or on the blog. And most importantly, share the stuff with anyone you think might benefit. And most importantly, finally, we need your financial support to keep this going. So please go to mormonstories.org, click on the donate button right now, and become a monthly donor. And not only will we continue this series with your support, but we'll provide this series to future generations so that people can have informed consent and engage Mormonism or not at whatever level they want to, having been given all the facts. Thanks, everybody. Stay tuned for another episode of Mormon Stories in the coming days, weeks, and months.